The baby was coughing again. Cecil Pruitt heard it through the ceiling before he heard anything else that morning, before the wind, before the creak of the old house settling against the cold, before Norma's feet found the floor on her side of the bed. The cough came in pairs, small and dry, a catching sound that had lived in the upstairs bedroom for 11 days now, and that the doctor in Kittanning had called a chest cold and addressed with a single instruction that had been sitting in Cecil's chest ever since like a stone he could not put down. Keep the child warm, keep her away from drafts. Cecil lay on his back in the dark and listened to his 4-year-old daughter cough and thought about what it meant to keep a child warm in a house where the cold came through the ceiling like water through a screen. He knew exactly where it came from. That was the particular cruelty of the thing he had known for years. The attic above those upstairs rooms had never been insulated in the 42 years since the house was built, and the northeast corner, directly above Ruth's bedroom, was the worst section of the entire roof. The chimney up there had pulled away from the adjacent roof board sometime in the 1930s, and the original chinking had dried to powder and fallen away in pieces. And what remained in its place was a gap that a man could fit 3 fingers into in some places, and through which the outside air entered the attic the way wind enters a broken window. Not slowly, not gently, but with intention, with velocity, with the specific character of cold that moves rather than settles, and that a child's body cannot defend against, regardless of how many quilts are piled on top of her. It was the 14th of November, 1953. The thermometer on the porch post had read 9 degrees at midnight. The forecast out of Pittsburgh said it would not climb above 15 for 4 days running. Norma's mother was arriving from Clarion on Saturday to help with Ruth, and she would be sleeping in the second upstairs room, which was nearly as cold as the first. Cecil got up at 5:15, dressed in the dark the way he had dressed every winter morning for 20 years, by feel and sequence and long habit, not needing to see, and went downstairs and put wood on the kitchen stove and stood at the window with his coffee, and made the decision he had been circling for 11 days. The attic was going to be fixed, not eventually, not when he had the money for the proper materials. Today. The proper materials were the problem, and he knew their price exactly because he had gone to price them 2 weeks before when the cough was new, and he was still thinking about the situation as something with a measured solution available to him at the building supply in Kittanning. The man behind the counter had walked him through the fiberglass bats. Good product, standard installation, appropriate for an attic of his square footage, and had arrived at $38 before labor. Cecil had nodded and said he would think on it, and had driven the 12 miles home with $38, sitting in his mind against a feed bill he had run up through the dry summer and an equipment note and a well pump that had given out in September, at a cost that still made him tighten the jaw when he let himself think about it directly. What was left after the necessary things were paid was not $38. It was not close to $38. That was the complete truth of his situation on the 14th of November, 1953, with a sick 4-year-old coughing in pairs through the ceiling above him. He finished his coffee and put on his coat and drove to the feed store in Kittanning, arriving when Arlen Kephart was unlocking the front door at 7:30. Arlen was 61 years old and had been behind that counter since before the Depression and had grown up farming 6 miles east of Cecil's place, and there was no practical problem that Cecil could bring to that counter that Arlen had not either encountered himself or watched someone else solve. Cecil waited while Vic Stonebreaker finished his business, and while old Dempsey Farwell, who came most mornings more for conversation than commerce, settled into his usual position near the door. Then he told Arlen about the attic. Not about Ruth. He did not say her name, did not say sick child, because that was not the language in which men of his generation and county brought their problems to each other. He said he had an attic that was making the upstairs rooms uninhabitable, and 4 days before company arrived, and $38 worth of problem, with considerably less than $38 worth of solution. Arlen listened with both forearms on the counter, and his eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance. The posture Cecil had seen on him 100 times, the posture of a man going through an internal inventory that was larger and more organized than it appeared from the outside. My daddy did their attic in 26, Arlen said. Sawdust from the Bodine mill, hydrated lime, borax out of a box. Stood up 30 years that I know of. Don't know what's become of it since. Dempsey Farwell said something from near the door about newspaper, and Arlen shook his head without looking at him and said newspaper held moisture and he would not trust it. Then he gave Cecil the proportions the way a man gives directions to a place he has driven to but never had occasion to describe. Approximate, confident, grounded in the authority of having been there. Roughly 8 or 9 parts sawdust to 1 part lime by volume, borax at perhaps 1 part to every 20 of the total mix. A little water worked in to bring the lime to its reaction without making the mix wet. Work gloves the whole time. Lime will burn you, which Cecil already knew from years of applying it to the pasture soil, where it went on by the bushel to correct the acid in the hill ground, and where a man who got it on wet skin long enough learned exactly why they called it quicklime in the old literature. Get the sawdust dry, old pile, not fresh shavings, because wet fiber would work against everything the lime was trying to do. Gerald Stump's mill, Arlen said. Pile behind the building. He'll tell you to help yourself. Cecil bought 2 50-pound bags of hydrated lime for $3.40 and a large box of borax for 80 cents and drove to Gerald Stump's mill, where Gerald was running oak through the head saw and could not hear a word until the saw stopped. When it stopped, Gerald listened to Cecil's request, pointed at the pile behind the building with his chin, and went back to his oak, which was roughly twice the number of words Gerald Stump committed to any single human interaction. The sawdust pile was 8 feet high and 20 feet at the base, a pale mountain of mixed hardwood, oak and ash with the occasional streak of cherry, since Gerald cut cherry for the furniture makers in Butler County, and the smell of it stayed in the pile long after the wood was gone. Cecil worked his way around the outside of the pile with a shovel, selecting the aged and dried material from the outer layers and avoiding the darker interior sections, where fresh shavings had packed together with moisture enough to clump in his fist. He filled the truck bed by tarp and shovel and drove home with it, sitting heavy, the smell of old millwood coming through the cab window he had cracked for the cold air to keep him alert. He pulled into the yard and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house. White paint gone thin and chalky, the long front porch, the kitchen addition his grandfather had built from timber off the South Hill, using lumber that had been standing since before anyone then living could remember. It looked like a house that worked, which it mostly did, except for the one specific way it was failing his daughter at 5 o'clock every morning, when she coughed in pairs through the ceiling, and he lay in the dark below her, listening and knowing exactly where the cold came from and what it was doing and what he had not yet done about it. He carried the materials to the porch and went inside. Norma was at the kitchen table with Ruth on her lap and a bowl of oatmeal going cold on the tray. Ruth looked up at him with the solemn, slightly accusing attention of a sick child who has been inside for 11 days and finds the arrival of her father from the outside world considerably more interesting than oatmeal. She had Norma's coloring and Cecil's eyes and the cough that came out of her in pairs, and he could not look at her without feeling the stone the doctor had put in his chest when he said, "Keep her warm, keep her away from drafts," as though these were simple instructions that required nothing from a man beyond the willingness to follow them. "What's all that?" Norma said, looking toward the porch. "Fixing the attic." She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look that was her version of asking whether he had thought this through sufficiently. Then she looked at Ruth, then back at him. "I'll keep her in the kitchen," she said, which was her way of saying she understood and she was with him. He pulled the attic stair down at 8:30 and climbed up with a flashlight and stood in the cold dark at the top and moved the beams slowly around the space, reacquainting himself with what he was dealing with. The attic ran the full footprint of the house, roughly 40 feet by 28 of rough-cut pine planking laid across the joists for storage, the bare rafters above, the gable vents at both ends admitting narrow lines of grey November light. He moved to the northeast corner and crouched at the chimney junction and held the flashlight steady and watched the dust in the beam move. It moved horizontally. It moved with intention. The gaps between the old brick and the adjacent roof boards were as bad as he had known they were, worse than he had let himself think about directly, long irregular cracks where the original chinking had dried to dust and fallen away, in some places wide enough that he could push his entire thumb inside and feel the outdoor air moving against his skin with enough force to be unmistakable. He went down and came back up with tin snips and sheet tin from the shop scrap pile and the can of stove mortar that lived above the kitchen stove for tending the firebox cracks. He cut the tin into sections, bent each piece to follow the irregular gap between brick and board, fitted them together like a slow puzzle, and nailed them with roofing nails, working the pieces close enough that no open seams remained between them. Then he worked the stove mortar into the remaining cracks with his fingers and a putty knife, pressing it into the spaces the tin could not reach, and smoothing it flat against the brick face. Stove mortar was silica-based and heat-tolerant, and would not dry out and crumble away the way the original chinking had. It would hold. He worked the chimney junction for 2 hours. The cold in that corner of the attic was a specific located cold, not the general cold of an unheated space, but a directional cold with a source, and as he worked, he could feel it diminishing, gap by gap, piece by piece as the tin went up and the mortar filled in behind it. When the last section was in place, he held the flashlight beam in the same spot where he had watched the dust move horizontally that morning. The dust drifted slowly downward. Still, the draft was gone from the northeast corner of his daughter's ceiling, and he felt that fact in a place considerably below his thinking mind. He allowed himself exactly the length of one breath to register it before moving to the west gable. The soffit gap on the west end was simpler than the chimney and in some ways more dispiriting, because it was pure neglect of the kind that accumulates in old structures, not from carelessness, but from the simple arithmetic of a farmer's time, which is never sufficient for everything that needs doing, and which therefore develops a hierarchy of urgency that sometimes leaves a soffit gap unaddressed for a decade because it is not yet the thing that will end you. A section of the original wood soffit had warped badly over the years, pulling away from the framing to leave an opening 3 inches across in places, through which the outside air entered in a thin, cold stream he could feel on his face from 6 feet away. He cut tin to cover it from the inside, bent the edges along the framing, nailed it firm, and stapled a piece of heavy canvas over it from the roll in the workshop, not because the canvas added meaningfully to the seal, but because old wood moves seasonally, and the canvas gave the tin something to bear against when it did. The eave channel was the third problem and the most architectural, not a defect but a feature. A deliberate airway running the full length of the house at both eave walls, between the top of the exterior framing and the bottom of the rafter structure. Cecil had understood its purpose since he first spent time in this attic as a young man. In summer, the channel allowed air to move from the soffits up through the attic to the gable vents, ventilating the roof structure and pulling moisture away from the boards before it could work into the wood and begin the slow rot that collapsed old roofs from the inside. He had no intention of sealing it permanently. What he needed was to stop the river of cold air that ran the full length of the house at ceiling height in both upstairs bedrooms during the winter months, to block the horizontal movement at floor level while leaving the upper portion of the channel clear for the ventilation. The roof required the rest of the year. He used craft paper, the heavy brown paper that came wrapped around feed deliveries, accumulated over months in the shop. He folded it into thick pads and pressed them firmly into the lower portion of the channel at both eave walls, running the full length of the house, packing it snug enough to block air movement at floor level. Over the craft paper, he nailed narrow strips of tin to hold the packing in place against the seasonal movement of the wood. He knew this was not permanent. He knew that in the spring he should look at it again with more time and better materials. Permanent was not what today required. He came down at noon and ate the sandwich Norma had left on the counter and looked in on Ruth, who was asleep on the parlor couch beneath 3 quilts with the color in her face of a child whose fever has broken and who needs nothing now but time and warmth and the draft to stop moving through the ceiling above her bed. He went back outside to mix the insulation. He set up the 2 galvanized washtubs in the yard and worked with the wind at his back. He measured the sawdust in first. 8 scoops to 1 of lime, the grain scoop his measure, working each load through his gloved fingers to break the clumps before adding the next. The old hardwood sawdust was dry and light in his hands, warm brown with flecks of ash and the occasional streak of cherry, and it had the smell of old mills and winter preparation, of wood fiber that had moved past fresh and past rotten into something perfectly stable between those two states. The lime went in as a fine white powder that rose in a cloud when it hit the sawdust and made him turn his face away and hold his breath. He wore his heaviest work gloves throughout, the ones he used for fence wire, and was careful with the lime the way he was careful with everything that had genuine capacity to harm. Deliberately, respectfully, without excessive caution, but with the full attention that the material deserved. He had used hydrated lime on his pasture soil for years, spreading it in early spring to correct the acid in the hill ground, and he understood its character completely, the way it heated when water touched it, the way it would raise blisters on wet skin if a man was careless and let it sit, the way it transformed over weeks and months in the presence of air and moisture into something stable and inert and harmless. He pressed a handful of the mixed sawdust and lime together in his fist. It held its shape for a moment, then broke apart cleanly. The lime was already doing something to the structure of the mix, binding the particles together in a loose matrix that resisted compaction in a way that plain sawdust never would. That resistance to compaction was the first thing Arlen's formula was solving, and Cecil understood it from watching old sawdust in other contexts, in stall bedding, in mulch piles, compress under its own weight over seasons, until whatever loft it had started with was gone, and it lay flat and dense and half its original thickness. Plain sawdust packed into an attic floor would do the same thing over years, settling until the insulation value it started with had diminished by half or more, and the cold found its way through the compressed mass with increasing ease. The lime held the loft. That was the foundation of the whole idea. He worked the borax through the mix with his fingers, distributing it as evenly as he could manage through the brown and white material. Cecil had kept borax under the sink for years, the way every farm household kept it. For laundry, for scrubbing, for the half-dozen practical purposes it accumulated in a working house over the decades since it had come into common use. What he was counting on here was its specific character as a material that insects found actively hostile. The carpenter ants and wood beetles that lived permanently in the structure of old farm buildings, given the opportunity, would colonize a warm, organic mass like plain sawdust with no hesitation, but borate-treated material was a different proposition entirely, caustic to soft-bodied insects on contact, and toxic when ingested, making it hostile habitat rather than merely neutral. For mice, and farm attic mice were not a question of if, but of how many. The lime component of the mix served a similar discouraging function, caustic enough underfoot and in the nasal passages that the treated surface was a substantially less appealing nesting ground than plain wood fiber. The borax also did something for fire resistance that Cecil thought about carefully before he committed to putting organic material into an attic above a wood-framed house. Plain dry sawdust could sustain smoldering combustion at temperatures that would not necessarily announce themselves immediately. A slow burn in an attic working against dry wood fiber could go a long time before it became visible from outside the structure, and Cecil was not a careless man about fire on a farm, where fire was among the worst things that could happen. The borax raised the effective ignition temperature of the mix and slowed the spread of flame through the treated wood fiber, not making it fireproof, nothing of the kind, but making it meaningfully safer than untreated dry sawdust in the same location. He had also, before he put down a single handful of the mix, gone over every inch of the attic wiring, original knob and tube installation from the 1920s, and tacked up every section where the cloth insulation on the wire had cracked or pulled away from the conductor. He was not going to introduce organic material into a space with exposed wiring and call that acceptable. He was not built that way. He added water last, a small amount, worked through the mix with the scoop slowly and with attention. He felt the tub warm slightly through his gloves as the lime began its reaction, a mild heat that rose through the material and confirmed that the chemistry was proceeding the way Arlen had described. The mix reached what he was aiming for, barely damp, holding its shape when pressed, breaking apart cleanly when released. He carried the tubs up through the attic hatch in stages, lifting them through the opening and sliding them across the pine planks to the work areas, the smell of lime and old sawdust and something faintly mineral rising around him in the closed attic space. the smell of a problem being addressed, of winter cold meeting something that had decided to hold against it. He spread the mix with a cut-down garden rake, moving it evenly between and beneath the storage planks, working it down between the joists with his hands where the rake could not reach, aiming for between 4 and 6 inches of depth throughout the open floor areas. He was not measuring with anything but his eye and his hands, the way a man measures anything he has learned to do well enough that the instrument is internal rather than external. The joists were 2 inches by 8 of old-growth pine, dry and stable and dark with age, and the mix settled between them cleanly, filling the cavities with a solidity that felt right in the way that physical work communicates adequacy sometimes without requiring numbers. The knee wall spaces at both sides of the house were the hardest work of the 2 days. These were the low triangular areas where the sloped ceiling of the second floor met the attic floor, cramped, irregular, accessible only through small framed openings that required him to fold nearly in half to pass through, and workable only by flashlight held in his teeth and hands that had to feel what they could not see. He pushed the mix back into the eave corners as far as he could reach, packing it against the rafters with his gloved hands, filling the space to the full depth of the rafter cord in the deepest sections, 14 inches in places, more than he was putting anywhere else, because the geometry of these spaces meant that cold attacked them from below the rafter slope as well as through the floor, coming in from 2 directions at once, and more material between his daughter and that cold was the most direct response he could make. He was still in the knee wall space on the east side at 4:30 when he heard Ruth cough once below him and then heard Norma's voice, low and immediate, and then quiet. He held still on the cold planking for a moment, listening to the quiet after the cough the way a man listens for what a sound tells him about what comes next. Then he turned back to the corner and kept working. He came down at 5 with lime dust on his coat and sawdust in his hair, and a back that had articulated its opinion of 2 days of bent and kneeling work on cold planking in terms that left nothing ambiguous. He washed at the kitchen sink, and Norma put a plate in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate together in the particular comfortable quiet of 2 people who have been married long enough that silence between them is not absence, but a different kind of presence. A frequency they had learned to transmit and receive without words over 17 years of shared mornings and shared problems. Ruth ate, Norma said. Good. Kept it down. Cecil nodded. Norma looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just the level, considering look she brought to things she was working out. East knee wall still to finish, she said. Section along the north rafter, then done, 4 hours tomorrow. She looked back at her coffee. Then she said, in the same even tone she used to report any observation that required reporting, I could feel it different in her room when I put her down tonight. Standing in there. Something's already different. Cecil said nothing for a moment. He thought about what it meant that she could feel it already, with the work not finished and the lime still working its slow chemistry through the sawdust in the cold dark above them. He thought about Arlen's father in a similar attic in 1926, probably on a similar deadline, with a similar winter arriving on a schedule that waited for no one. He thought about $4.20 and 2 days of his own labor, and the sawdust that Gerald Stump had told him to take for nothing because the mill had more than it could use. I'll finish tomorrow, he said. He finished in 4 hours the next morning, working the east knee wall and the north rafter section with the efficiency of a man who had learned the material's character completely on the first day, and was now simply executing what he already understood. He came down the attic stair for the last time at 11:30, and folded it back up into the ceiling and stood for a moment in the upstairs hallway with his hand still on the cord, feeling the hallway around him. It was cold. It was a farmhouse in November, and it was cold. But the quality of the cold was different from what he had known in this hallway for the previous 11 winters. It was present without moving, settled rather than driven, a cold that would yield to a fire rather than fight it. 6 nights later, the temperature dropped to 7 degrees and held there through a long and windless Tuesday. Cecil was awake before 4, the way he was often awake in the deepest cold of early morning, and he lay in the dark listening to the house. The house was quiet. Ruth's room was quiet above him. Not the intermittent quiet between the pairs of coughing he had learned over 11 nights to brace himself against, but a complete and uninterrupted quiet. The quiet of a child sleeping through the cold without effort, without the body working against something that was coming through the ceiling and needed to be worked against. He got up at 5 and went upstairs. He moved quietly down the hall and put his hand on the door of Ruth's room and opened it and stood in the doorway. The room was cold. He was not pretending otherwise. It was genuinely, measurably cold. A farmhouse in November with the fire out for 4 hours. The kind of cold that would have his breath fogging in the light if there had been light to see it by. But the cold was still. It was present without moving. There was no edge of air coming off the ceiling, no thin directional draft that had made the room feel colder than its temperature, because moving cold is always harder on a body than still cold of the same degree. Harder to hold against, harder to sleep inside of, harder for a small chest to heal inside of. The cold in that room on that Tuesday morning was a cold that quilts could address. That was different from what it had been. That was the whole of the difference, and it was everything. He stood in the doorway and did not move for a long moment. In the bed, under the quilts that Norma had layered and arranged with the specific precision that was its own form of love, Ruth was asleep on her side with one hand open on the pillow beside her face, the way small children sleep when they are comfortable, completely, without self-consciousness, without any part of the body standing guard against something. Her breathing was even and slow. Her color in the dim light that came in from the hallway was normal. The cough was not present in the room. It was simply not there. The way the draft was not there. The two absences connected in a way that Cecil did not need anyone to explain to him or confirm for him or put into language of any kind. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom at 5 in the morning in the deep cold of November 1953 and felt something that was not triumph and was not relief and was not pride, though it contained elements of all three. It was quieter than any of those things. It was the specific feeling that comes from a hard thing having yielded, not to money or to luck or to the right materials arriving at the right moment, but to work and knowledge and the willingness to spend 2 days in a cold attic with $4.20 and a truck full of free sawdust and the memory of what Arlen Keephart's father had done to a similar attic in 1926. The feeling did not require anything from the room or the child or the morning. It was complete in itself, standing there in the doorway in the cold and the dark, with his hands at his sides. Then Ruth stirred. She turned onto her back and opened her eyes and looked at him with the serious, slightly reproachful expression of a 4-year-old who has been woken at 5 in the morning by a large cold person standing in the doorway of her room and who has opinions about this. "Daddy," she said. "Go back to sleep," he said. She looked at him the way children look at adults when they are deciding whether the instruction is worth following. "Are you fixing something?" she said. "Already fixed," he said. She considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old for whom the world is still largely a place where adults either fix things or fail to fix them, and the distinction matters enormously. Her eyes were going slow and heavy at the edges. "Is it warmer?" she said. Cecil looked at the ceiling above her bed, at the pine boards and the old joists and the dark space beyond them, where $4 and 2 days of November work had built something that was holding right now, at this moment, in the specific temperature of this room, in this house on this morning. He looked at his daughter's hand open on the pillow, the fingers slightly curled, relaxed in sleep the way a hand only relaxes when the body beneath it has decided that no defense is necessary. "Getting there," he said. "Go to sleep." She went to sleep. He pulled the door most of the way closed and stood in the hallway in the dark for a moment, and then he went downstairs to start the fire. He was at Arlen's counter at 8:30 when the feed store opened, not because he needed anything, but because that was how the transaction worked. A man who received useful knowledge and found that it solved the problem had an obligation to come back and close the account. He told Arlen that the chimney patch had held, that the mix was in, that the upstairs rooms were different. Arlen nodded in the manner of a man who had not doubted any of it, but was satisfied to have it confirmed. Dempsey Farwell was at the door, and he listened to all of it with the careful attention of a man filing information he expects to need. When Cecil finished, Dempsey said, "What did the whole thing run you?" Cecil told him, $4.20 for everything purchased. 2 days of his own labor, sawdust free from Gerald Stump's pile behind the mill. Dempsey was quiet for a moment, doing his own arithmetic. "My upstairs rooms," he said. "Talk to Gerald first," Cecil said. "Get the old dry material from the outside of the pile, not the fresh shavings from the inside." Dempsey nodded slowly, storing it. Arlen was already turning to the next customer. The knowledge moved on from there, the way it had always moved in those communities, not through programs or formal channels, but from man to man at feed store counters and across fence lines and at cattle sales in December, each person adapting what they had heard to what they had on hand. Each person solving their version of the same problem with what their particular situation made available. It was real knowledge, arrived at by real experience, carried in the heads of men who had no particular interest in being remarkable and who would have been confused by the suggestion that what they did was worth writing down. It was worth writing down. The cold in a farmhouse upstairs in western Pennsylvania in November of 1953 was a real cold. The cough it produced in a 4-year-old was a real cough. The $4.20 and the 2 days in the attic, and the thing that Arlen's father had learned from someone and passed to Arlen and Arlen had passed to Cecil, were a real solution. Not the best possible solution, not the solution a building supply catalog would have recommended, but a solution that worked in the world that actually existed for men like Cecil Pruitt, which was the world of what was available and what could be afforded and what needed doing before Saturday, when company arrived and before the temperature dropped to 7 degrees, and before the doctor's instruction, keep her warm, keep her away from drafts, went from being a stone in a man's chest to being something that could no longer wait for better circumstances. Ruth stopped coughing. The house was better. The knowledge moved on. That is the whole story. And when you think about it carefully, it is also everything that needs to be said. If this story reached something in you, a memory of an old house, a grandparent's attic, the smell of lime on cold morning air, the sound of a child coughing through a ceiling that a man who loved her had not yet found a way to fix, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who came from a place like Cecil's, or who wishes they understood what those places really were. This community grows one story at a time, and every person you bring here is another person who gets to remember that the knowledge those farmers carried, the lime and the sawdust, and the $4.20, and the 2 days in the cold attic above a sick child's bedroom, was real knowledge earned by real hands worth keeping alive. We have more stories where this one came from. We will keep bringing them to you as long as you keep showing up for them. This video is inspired by true events and authentic historical practices documented across American agricultural history. It does not aim to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Cecil Pruitt is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced exactly this situation: drafty old farmhouses, limited resources, sick children, and winter arriving on a schedule that waited for no man. His story is their story. We tell it so it is not forgotten.